The Ultramarines stationed inside the Magna Macragge Civitas have survived 3 separate incursions in the past solar month alone. Konrad Curze came down from the Dark Angel's flagship Invincible Reason, broke out of a cell that was supposed to hold a Primarch, stole a drop pod, and punched through Macragge's atmosphere unannounced. The city's sensor net and Macragge's sensor coverage isn't a modest system. The capital world of Ultramar is the command hub of a star empire Roboute Guilliman built specifically to survive the worst the Heresy can produce, is working through the contact classification sequence. A falling drop pod has a heat signature, a radar return, a transponder gap. Identifying it, tracing the trajectory, raising the appropriate alert. These steps take seconds. Somewhere in the lower levels of the palace complex, a Primarch is in chains. Vulkan, Primarch of the Salamanders, 18th son of the Emperor, fell through Macragge's atmosphere burning. He died on re-entry. He came back. By the time the Ultramarines reached him, his mind wasn't intact, violent and incoherent, too dangerous to leave unrestrained, unable to distinguish an ally's restraining hands from an enemy's. They bound him. They waited. Dan Abnett documents the state he arrived in through the Unremembered Empire. Vulkan, insane from his torture, falls upon the world. This is the Primarch whose Legion mantra for months has been Vulkan Lives, a statement of faith held by sons who couldn't confirm their father's survival. He is alive. He is unrecognizable. The chains hold. The sensors watch. Then Curze is on the surface, and something happens before any other warning reaches anyone. Vulkan breaks free of his restraints. He walks directly into Guilliman's private armory, not the general stores, the personal arsenal of the 13th Legion's Primarch, which carries security proportionate to its contents, and he pillages it. Armed, he leaves the palace. He goes hunting. The sequence documented in the Unremembered Empire runs in this order. Curze arrives, Vulkan moves. Not, the alarm sounds, then Vulkan reacts. Not, intelligence reaches him, then he acts. A bond had formed between Curze and Vulkan during the months of captivity aboard the Nightfall, and that bond functions as a detection mechanism that operates independently of conventional alert structures. He senses Curze the way a man who has been burned by the same flame dozens of times knows the heat before the light reaches him. He isn't alerted, he senses. That's not a fire guy, that's something else entirely. Every Vulkan abilities video covers fire resistance. Every Vulkan video covers resurrection. Some cover the Curze torture arc in outline. What consistently disappears from those discussions, and the audiences of those same videos have been documenting the gap in the comments for years, are 5 specific capabilities that change the picture of who Vulkan actually is in the lore. The bond-based detection is 1. His aura functioning as something distinct from generic Primarch authority is a 2nd. The unresolved debate about what his red eyes actually perceive is a 3rd. His physical placement within the Primarch hierarchy is the 4th. The psychological architecture of what perpetuality extracts under Curze's specific conditions across 3 novels and the better part of a decade of Horus Heresy output is the 5th and the most serious. Before any of those categories can mean anything, there are words this script will say repeatedly and will say correctly. The Primarch's name is spelled Vulkan. It's pronounced Vulkan. Short U, hard K, Germanic root, the same linguistic family that gives us volcano, not Vulcan. Vulkan is the Roman god of the forge and the Star Trek species. His homeworld nocturne is Nocturne, silent final E. His tormentor, Konrad Curze, Konradcurze, is Konrad Curze. Ultramar is Ultramar. The arch in Primarch sounds like arc, not like the arch in architecture. Primarch. The previous generation of Vulkan content generated 32 documented complaint points across 5 separate pronunciation errors. A corrective video that mispronounces the name on the first word has already failed its premise. What happened to make the Macragge detection possible begins on Istvan 5. The year is 006M31. Three loyalist legions, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands, have descended on Istvan 5 to support what they believe is an ongoing compliance operation against traitor elements. The operation isn't what they were told. 4 traitor legions already on the surface, and 4 more positioned in the fleet above, have coordinated what will be recorded as the Drop Site Massacre. When the signal comes, they open fire from behind. The Iron Warriors fleet contributes an orbital atomic strike to the opening sequence. That strike reaches Vulkan's position at the Salamander's drop zone. The Warhammer 40k fandom wiki specifies the result as complete molecular disintegration. What comes back from that strike shouldn't come back. Vulkan's biology, a rare mutation category the lore designates as perpetual, carrying extraordinary cellular regeneration capable of resurrection from any damage, disagrees. He had not known, before that moment, that he was a perpetual. The fandom wiki is explicit. The ability was unknown to him until the orbital strike at Istvan 5. Years of Great Crusade service alongside Ferrus Manus, who became his closest brother among the Primarchs, whom he trained with on Mars in the weapon forges, whose death is about to happen on this same killing field. None of his previous wounds had triggered the regeneration at a threshold he would have noticed. Molecular obliteration was the threshold. He came back through it into a massacre, surrounded by traitors who weren't expecting him to still be functional. He fought. He fell. He came back. He fought again. Konrad Curze found him in this cycle and made a decision. The Night Lord's flagship Nightfall isn't described as a welcoming space. What Curze establishes aboard it, documented across Vulkan Lives, Horus Heresy Book 26 by Nick Kime, published December 2013, is systematic, deliberate, and methodical in the way that only someone who understands he has unlimited time can afford to be. He personally decapitates Vulkan. He rips out his throat. He stabs him through the chest and tears him apart. He has Vulkan eviscerated. He orders him shot at close range by bolters, not once, but many times, the accounts noting the plurality of the fusillade. He vents him through a starship engine exhaust shaft, which isn't a quick death. He expels him into the void completely unprotected, which in hard vacuum is also not a quick death. He uses different methods because he is learning the failure modes of each one, whether velocity matters, whether total destruction of a specific organ system is the variable, whether sufficient dispersal prevents reassembly. The answer, across months of captivity, is no to all of it. Every time, Vulkan's body reassembles. Every time, Curze watches the stages of the process. The watching is important. It isn't the behavior of someone acting purely from frustration, though frustration is also present. Curze is paying attention to something specific, the exact signature of how this particular man comes back from this particular type of killing. The pattern of regeneration, the timing, the stages. He is learning Vulkan's dying through repetition in the same way a smith learns a metal's properties through hammerwork. He accumulates intimate knowledge of the process from the outside across dozens of repetitions. Whatever sensitivity Vulkan develops to Curze's specific presence through this period, Curze is simultaneously building a parallel and precise knowledge of Vulkan's. The tactical recognition arrives clearly in Vulkan Lives. Physical killing isn't the available tool. The appropriate tool is psychological. Curze does not simply want Vulkan dead. If he did, the first half-dozen deaths would have been sufficient evidence that this approach is non-viable, and he would have moved on. What Curze wants, documented across community synthesis of the novel's text, and confirmed in the stated motivation preserved in lore discussions, is to prove that Vulkan is just as evil as himself. He believes that if he can break the most humane Primarch, force him into cruelty, demonstrate that virtue is performance rather than character, Then Curze wins an argument he has been making about the nature of the Emperor's sons since before the heresy began. Perpetuality means the project can run indefinitely. There is no mercy condition that death would otherwise impose. To prosecute the psychological campaign, Curze recruits Davenite priests. Their contribution is chaos sorcery-induced hallucinations, and the specific hallucination they generate for Vulkan is a corrupted version of Ferrus Manus. Not Ferrus as he was in the Forge on Mars or on campaign during the Great Crusade. A version of Ferrus constructed to deliver a specific message, that Vulkan is weak, a failure, a coward. The choice of Ferrus as the instrument isn't incidental. Ferrus Manus died at Istvan 5, on this same killing field where Vulkan's perpetuality first activated, where the atomic strike hit, where the betrayal happened. Ferrus was killed. Vulkan carries documented guilt over the deaths at Istvan 5, over who survived and who didn't, over what the massacre cost. Curze or his priests selected the guilt surface and built the instrument precisely to cut it. The second documented method is more direct. Curze forces Vulkan to watch him torture and kill innocent people. The logic is exact. Vulkan's unusual empathy toward ordinary humans is noted in the Great Crusade's records. It's the defining characteristic that makes him distinct among Primarchs, the quality that drove him to kneel before his own legion in gratitude for their sacrifices at the Terrace Division, the source of the Promethean Creed's insistence that the people being fought for aren't abstractions. Curze identified what Vulkan is. He built the instrument that targets it. The body couldn't be killed permanently. The love for human life turned against him was the only available weapon. Internal reconstruction of Vulkan's psychological state during this period, based on the text of Vulkan Lives, captures him on the edge of a mental breakdown and maintaining himself through repeated internal assertion. He is a good person. He is doing the right thing. He holds on. The text's portrait of Vulkan on the Nightfall isn't passive suffering, it's active resistance, a sustained act of will requiring constant renewal against a campaign that is specifically designed to outlast that will. Eventually, Curze makes the mistake of placing Dawnbringer at the center of Perturabo's maze. The maze inside the Nightfall was designed by the Primarch of the Iron Warriors, who built siege works and death traps at a professional level the rest of the Heresy couldn't match. At its center, Curze placed Vulkan's personal thunderhammer and the corpses of his comrades. The psychological logic? Vulkan will move toward what he loves, and the maze will destroy him. Vulkan navigates the maze. He retrieves Dawnbringer. Then he activates the teleporter built into the hammer's head, a function Curze apparently had no intelligence on, and Vulkan vanishes from the Nightfall into Macragge's upper atmosphere. He burns up on re-entry. He dies again. He comes back on Macragge's surface, violent and incoherent. The Ultramarines find him and put him in chains. Then Curze steals a drop pod and follows. Curze himself possessed limited psychic ability. The Lexicanum, citing shadows of treachery, documents him destroying a series of lights via a telekinetic pulse. His curse visions, the precognitive nightmare sight that showed him blood and destruction at every turn, the reason his homeworld Nostromo was destroyed, the reason he is called the Night Haunter, represent an active warp output of a different kind. He was operating with some form of genuine psychic presence throughout the torture sequence. Vulkan carries no official psyker classification. The Games Workshop rules text for Vulkan contains no mention of psychic abilities and no psyker designation. He isn't classified alongside Magnus the Red, or Jagatai Khan, or Malkador. The Horus Heresy supplements and Forge World entries don't label him as a psychic individual. But all Primarchs are, to some degree, warp-saturated entities. This follows from how they were made, drawn from the Emperor's own genetic and psychic substance, scattered across the galaxy as infants, shaped by whatever worlds they landed on, but carrying in their architecture the fundamental material of something that isn't purely biological. The lore's position across the Horus Heresy series is that Primarchs carry latent psychic potential, regardless of whether it manifests in ways that earn formal classification. Leman Russ and Rogel Dorn aren't classified as psychers either. Something operates in each of them that outruns the formal category. For Vulkan, the specific evidence is the bond. The Unremembered Empire documents its existence and its function. A bond had formed between Curze and Vulkan could sense when the Night Haunter was nearby. The detection operates before any formal warning structure. He breaks free, raids the armory, and goes hunting. The detection isn't described as visual or auditory, it's prior to those, a registering of presence that functions independently of conventional sense data. How to categorize this is genuinely contested, and the script won't adjudicate it, because doing so would require claiming certainty the primary text does not provide. One reading is somatic rather than psychic, extended, violent, intimate proximity across months and dozens of killings creates a form of conditioned physical recognition of one specific individual. Vulkan's body regenerated with Curze present at each death. Whatever biological systems perpetuals use to maintain continuity across multiple deaths may have registered the specific sensory combination associated with Curze's presence as a recurring signature. On this reading, the detection is more like a scar that responds to a specific stimulus than a psychic awareness of distant threats. The other reading is that Curze's active warp output during months of captivity, his telekinetic pulses, his precognitive visions, the Davenite priest's sorcery applied to Vulkan repeatedly, left an impression on Vulkan's own latent warp sensitivity. A receiver, under this interpretation, develops tuning to the specific frequency of the source it was continuously exposed to. The bond is a psychic residue of prolonged, forced proximity to a psyker. Neither reading is settled by the novel. What the novel establishes is the bond and the detection. The mechanism is left open. The commenter who flagged this scene, pointing at a passage in a Black Library novel where Vulkan registers Curze before the machines do, and noting that this fact disappears from every ability's discussion, wasn't claiming to know the mechanism. They were pointing at the fact and noting its absence from the record. They were correct. Every Primarch has an aura. This is established directly in the novel record. 1000 Sons depicts Magnus reducing human remembrancers to tears through what the text describes as seeming divinity. 1000 Sons Chapter 11 depicts Azek Ahriman, a chief librarian of the 1000 Sons, not an unaugmented mortal, a trained psyker in his own right, kneeling before Leman Russ through sheer force of presence. These are class features of what Primarchs are, 20 superhuman entities built from the Emperor's own genetic material create an environmental effect on the people around them. This isn't unique to anyone. The question is whether Vulkan's version does something distinct that isn't reducible to the shared baseline. In Vulkan Lives, Nick Kime depicts a human remembrancer named Seraph being granted an audience with Vulkan in his forge. The Reddit thread that surfaced this excerpt is titled, "A Remembrancer Bears the Heat of." The choice of the word bears is doing specific work. The scene, as reconstructed from the novel and from a YouTube video retelling that cites the text, places Seraph in Vulkan's presence, not simply inside a hot workspace, but in the presence of something the workshop itself does not fully account for. The heat Seraph endures is presented as something Vulkan generates and projects, rather than something incidentally present in the room. The YouTube description of that reconstruction uses the phrase "enduring the unbearable" for Seraph's experience. A YouTube description isn't primary source material, but it confirms how readers who have the text interpret the scene's thermal language. This thermal quality separates Vulkan's aura from the baseline in a specific and testable way. Magnus's effect on the remembrancers is psychic and awe-based. It involves their perception of divinity, their emotional collapse before something their minds can't process. Russ's effect on Ahriman is presence-based dominance. the overwhelming of a trained warrior's volitional resistance by something that simply outscales it. Vulkan heats the air. The mechanism is different in kind, not merely degree. A mortal in Vulkan's forge isn't just psychologically overpowered. They are physically in a hotter environment, and the source of the heat is him. The second element is his empathic function. The fandom wiki records Vulkan's unusual empathy for a Primarch towards average humans as a documented characteristic from the Great Crusade period. The word unusual is doing specific work in that entry. Primarchs are built for war, and most of them relate to ordinary humans as either assets or manageable variables. Vulkan's relationship to the people around him in the text reads as something closer to registration. He perceives their emotional states as information, not as background noise. The Horus meeting makes this concrete. Before Istvan V, before the Heresy formally breaks, Vulkan has completed Dawnbringer. He built the hammer as a gift for Horus, the War Master, following the Night Lord's campaign at Karatan, the one where Curze had been placed in Vulkan's care, and Curze's massacre of the city's population had ended that arrangement. He meets Horus to present the weapon. He senses darkness within him. The fandom wiki's entry on Dawnbringer documents the decision directly. Vulkan detected something in Horus and kept the hammer. The detection was private, intuitive, and correct in a way the political situation had not yet made available to anyone else. The honest limit here is that proving Vulkan's aura as a mechanically distinct system, separate from the generic Primarch baseline, requires extrapolating from evidence that is real but scattered. The Seraphsine's heat language is the strongest specific indicator. The Horus detection is the strongest consequence-bearing example. A passage where another Primarch flinches specifically from Vulkan's proximity the way Ahriman flinches from Russ isn't in the available record. The commenter who stated he didn't mention Vulkan's aura is a power on its own was tracking something real. Whether it constitutes a fully separate mechanical category is the honest limit of what the sources confirm. Vulkan's eyes glow red. This isn't a cosmetic trait or a generic Primarch characteristic. The fandom wiki documents it as an environmental adaptation resulting from Nocturne's extreme radiation levels, which altered the local human population's physiology over generations. The people of Nocturne developed obsidian dark skin and glowing red eyes in direct response to their world's conditions. Vulkan adapted the same traits after landing there as an infant. The Salamanders chapter carries a gene seed flaw that replicates this adaptation in recruits exposed to Nocturne's radiation. The same physiological response triggered in each successive generation. The eyes are adapted. The debate is what they're adapted for. The night vision argument draws on environmental logic. Nocturne alternates between extreme states, volcanic light bright enough to see by at great distances, and total darkness in underground cave systems where the population shelters during the tidal events triggered by the companion world Prometheus. Eyes optimized for this kind of rapid, extreme variation in ambient brightness would develop light amplification capacity, the ability to operate across the full range from volcanic glare to absolute dark, without the delay that normal human night adaptation requires. Space Marine physiology provides enhanced low-light vision as a general Astartes trait. Vulkan, whose physiology reflects Nocturne more completely than any Legion recruits, would plausibly extend this further as a baseline. The infrared argument draws on a specific detail in Salamander's lore that rarely surfaces in ability discussions. A Bolter and Chainsword forum thread cataloging obscure Salamander's facts contains this entry. Salamanders carry identification markings that are visible in the infrared spectrum, and these markings can be seen by. The full sentence isn't recovered in the available excerpt, but the grammatical structure implies a subject capable of performing that scene. The most coherent reading is that salamanders can identify each other through markings invisible to standard light perception, which requires infrared-capable eyes. If the salamander's gene seed, drawn from Vulkan's own genome, confers infrared perception as a biological feature, then Vulkan, as the source, shares it. This is the single most textually specific piece of evidence either side of this debate can claim, and it points toward thermal perception rather than light amplification. The thematic coherence of thermal perception matters as supporting context, though it isn't proof by itself. Vulkan's entire orientation toward the physical world is organized around heat, the forge, the Promethean Creed's fire metaphors, the heat language in the Seraph scene, the drakes he hunted on Nocturne as a child, the name of the Legion. Thermal perception would make him literally oriented around heat at the sensory level, not just culturally. Light amplification is a useful survival tool. Thermal perception would be something stranger and more specific, a way of seeing that aligns with what fire and heat actually mean to him beyond the symbolic. What neither reading has is a passage from Vulkan's own point of view describing what he sees in darkness. Neither has an authorial statement or supplement ruling settling the question. The bolter and chainsword detail points in one direction without confirming it. Both interpretations are defensible. Both are consistent with the available text. The community has been split on this since the Heresy novels started populating Vulkan's physiology, and the split is legitimate. Anyone who presents a settled answer is imposing certainty onto a question the lore chose to leave open. Vulkan is described throughout the Horus Heresy novel series as the physically strongest of the Primarchs in terms of raw strength, to the point where he held back during sparring with his brothers. In Vulkan Lives, chapter 31, he tells Konrad Curze directly, in the sparring cages, he used to hold back, especially against Curze. The placement of that line inside the torture arc gives it a specific weight. Curze has spent months killing him. Vulkan is, in this moment, telling his tormentor that even at their most adversarial, during competitive sparring before any of this began, Vulkan was suppressing himself. The implication? Curze knew this was happening. He was always fighting a restrained version of Vulkan. Chapter 10 documents him hauling a storm sword. A storm sword is a super heavy assault tank, and the novel's reference weight for the vehicle is 302 tons. The text describes the action in terms that imply direct physical transportation rather than mechanical assistance. In Echoes of Eternity, chapter 27, during the Siege of Terra, Vulkan strikes Magnus the Red with enough force that the novel describes the impact using the structural members of a warlord titan as its scale reference. The force is sufficient to shatter the shin of that class of machine. A warlord titan stands over 30 meters tall. Its armor is measured in meters of ceramite and adamantium. The text chooses that comparison deliberately because it's the unit of measurement that communicates what is actually happening. Chapter 16 Urdrakul, forged by Vulkan in an unconscious state through the Emperor's psychic guidance, shatters one of Ferrus Manus's metallic arms. Those arms were composed of living necrodermis, a metal the lore had treated as effectively indestructible. Vulkan built a weapon while unconscious that disagrees. The lore's consistent position across Horus Heresy sources, following Ferrus Manus's death at Istvan 5, is that Vulkan becomes the physically strongest living Primarch without qualification. Ferrus had been the closest peer. With Ferrus gone, the question of who ranks second to Vulkan at the physical strength comparison isn't contested in the novel record. The caveat about demon-buffed Primarchs is valid. Angron, following his elevation, operates with cornate enhancement layered onto his baseline, but that is a different category of measurement. Vulkan's tier is defined by what his own biology and perpetual physiology provide, compared like for like. The evidence consistently places him at the ceiling. Everything in the previous sections is interesting. This section is where the video's emotional center lives. Vulkan didn't know he was a perpetual before Istvan 5. This fact changes the entire structure of what Curze did to him. He had never died before. He had no framework, no precedent, no prior encounter with the process. When the Iron Warrior's orbital strike reduced him to something that shouldn't have been able to regenerate, he came back with no category for what had just happened. The first time he experienced perpetual resurrection, the experience was molecular obliteration in the middle of a massacre. The second death followed shortly after, still at Istvan 5. Then Curze found him, and the deaths started happening on a schedule. The accumulation across Vulkan Lives runs across months of captivity. The specific total number of deaths during that period isn't presented in the novel with a precise count. What the text presents is the variety and thoroughness of the methods, the duration of the captivity, and the progressive psychological toll on a man who is experiencing all of this without a prior template for what perpetuality means. He isn't a practiced perpetual who has spent decades building a psychological framework for surviving death repeatedly. He is someone for whom molecular obliteration was the introduction, and Konrad Curze's specific imagination was the curriculum. Old Earth, Horus Heresy, Book 47, by Nick Kime, provides the most precise single statement of what that accumulation does over time. When Vulkan walks toward the Emperor, the text reads, "Every step brought greater pain, both physical and mental, as Vulkan relived every one of his many deaths. Not pain from current injuries, not the ache of active wounds, the reliving. Each death remaining present in some form, accessible, retrievable, laid over consciousness as something that does not depart with the body's healing. Perpetual resurrection regenerates tissue. What it apparently stores in whatever architecture maintains identity continuity across multiple deaths isn't subject to the same regenerative schedule as the body. The arc across 3 novels shows the progression at each stage. In Vulkan Lives, Vulkan is on the edge of a mental breakdown and holding himself together through repeated internal assertion. The text positions him as actively preventing psychological collapse through something that reads as a sustained and constantly renewed act of will. He is resisting. He holds on. The novel's psychological portrait of Vulkan on the Nightfall isn't passive suffering. It's a specific kind of combat being conducted entirely inside his own mind, against an opponent who has unlimited time and the specific knowledge of what hurts most. In the Unremembered Empire, Vulkan arrives insane. Reviews of the novel and community engagement with the text consistently use that framing. The Primarch arrives broken. The question the community has debated since the novel's release is whether the Macragge insanity represents the cumulative damage of the Nightfall period finally reaching a threshold, or whether the specific additional death from re-entry was the fracture point on top of already accumulated damage, or some combination. The text does not settle this. What the text establishes is that he arrives broken, and the Ultramarines have to put him in chains. The Unremembered Empire. Chapter 18 is cited in battle tier analyses as the source for this documentation, and the novel's surrounding material confirms the mental state through the behavior it describes. He fights Curze across Macragge regardless. The rolling duel across the city is documented in the Unremembered Empire. At one point, Curze shoots Vulkan's head off. Vulkan is back before he hits the ground. He has learned, on Macragge, to focus his will and accelerate the regeneration, turning the mechanism of his suffering into a tactical tool. He retrieves Dawnbringer. He drives Curze. The moment that community threads identify as peak Vulkan, Vulkan confronting Curze with the hammer, the exchange preserved in Vulkan Lives, Chapter 31, captures the man who has been killed dozens of times by this specific person, now standing over him with his own weapon and making clear that the arithmetic of the situation has changed. And then John Grammaticus, a perpetual operating under the direction of the Xenos organization called the Cabal, kills Vulkan with the Fulgurite, a petrified bolt of the Emperor's own psychic energy, the one substance documented in the Unremembered Empire, Chapter 14, as the only thing capable of truly killing a perpetual. Grammaticus's action is intended to restore Vulkan's mind by sacrificing his own perpetual nature. The stasis capsule Guilliman crafts, with the words "Unbound Flame" carved into its side, carries Vulkan back to Nocturne. At Mount Deathfire, he resurrects. He wakes into old Earth, carrying every death. The philosophical frame around Curze's entire campaign intensifies everything that happened in the Nightfall. His stated motivation across Vulkan Lives, preserved in community synthesis of the novel and consistent across multiple discussions of the text, is to prove that Vulkan is as evil as himself. Not as strong, not as dangerous, not as efficient, as evil. Curze believes that virtue in a Primarch is performance, that under sufficient pressure, the most humane of the Emperor's sons will reveal the same essential nature as the worst. The psychological cost of perpetuality in this context isn't an unfortunate side effect of captivity. It's the campaign's enabling architecture. Without perpetuality, Vulkan dies in the early stages of the torture sequence, and Curze never gets enough repetitions to make his philosophical argument. With perpetuality, Curze has unlimited access, and the only variable is whether Vulkan can sustain the internal assertion, "I am a good person, I am doing the right thing," indefinitely. He holds it for months. He fractures on Macragge. He recovers enough, eventually, to stand at the siege of Terra with moral clarity in echoes of eternity. The damage was severe and recurring. The Old Earth passage confirms it persisted into the later Heresy arc, but it wasn't total. What the TV trope's Horus Heresy entry states, that Curze destroyed his mind, is accurate for the Macragge period and represents a genuine breaking point. What the subsequent novels show is that the architecture partially rebuilt itself. Not cleanly, not completely, but enough for the man to continue. The Horus Heresy Legions game preserves a line that belongs to the Nightfall period. The quote, "I am not sure I can be broken." 4 words of uncertainty, carrying the weight of everything that was trying to make that uncertainty resolve wrong. Not, "I can't be broken." Not, "I won't be broken." Not sure. The phrasing of a man who needs the proposition to be true because the cost of its being false is already visible from where he's standing. The Salamanders at Istvan V couldn't confirm whether their Primarch was alive or dead in the massacre's immediate aftermath. They adopted the mantra, "Vulkan Lives," as a statement of faith held in the absence of evidence. They said it because they needed it to be true, because the alternative, that the Legion's father was gone, that the fire was out, wasn't something the surviving sons could function with. The mantra eventually proved accurate. He survived the orbital strike, the Nightfall, Macragge's atmosphere, the Fulgurite, the siege. He is alive. What Old Earth adds to the mantra is the weight behind it. Every step brings greater pain, both physical and mental, as he relives every one of his many deaths. Perpetually alive. Perpetually carrying the full record of what being perpetually alive, in Konrad Curze's specific hands, required. The 5 categories the comment sections have been identifying for years. The detection bond documented in the Unremembered Empire. The aura with its thermal quality and empathic function evidenced in Vulkan Lives. The vision mechanics that the text left genuinely open between 2 defensible readings, with the infrared markings detail providing the most specific evidence in either direction. The physical tier anchored directly in the novel texts. 302 tons in Chapter 10. Warlord Titan Force scaling in Echoes of Eternity. Ferris's arms in Old Earth, Chapter 16. The sparring cage admission in Vulkan Lives, Chapter 31. And perpetuality as a sentence rather than a superpower. Specifically, the sentence of never being released, of carrying every death forward as the Old Earth passage explicitly documents, of being exactly the kind of target Curze needed, precisely because the mercy of finality was never available. The mantra is true. He lives. Under the conditions Curze engineered, that is the entire problem. Subscribe for more stories like this.